We will reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-free trade area partners from 50% of 2024 levels, as it is today, to 20% of those levels. This will open up more than $850 million in new domestic demand for Canadian steel. We will reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-CUSMA free trade area partners from 100% of 2024 levels to 75% of those levels, unlocking more than $540 million in additional market access for our producers.
The shockwaves are spreading across North America as Canada takes bold action in response to U.S. tariffs that have rocked its steel and lumber industries. For months, Canadian producers have been battling an uphill fight, trying to maintain their market share while imported steel and lumber become increasingly expensive due to punitive tariffs imposed south of the border. What began as a trade dispute has evolved into a critical economic battle that could reshape supply chains, domestic production, and the very future of construction and manufacturing in both countries. U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and lumber were designed to protect American industries, but the repercussions have been far more complex. Canadian producers have seen their profits shrink, their exports struggle to find buyers, and their overall market share eroded. The cost of imported materials in the U.S. has risen sharply, which in turn has affected American manufacturers relying on Canadian products. The situation has created a ripple effect: higher prices for steel and lumber, delayed projects, and increased pressure on contractors, builders, and companies who depend on these essential materials. In response to this mounting crisis, Mark Carney and the Canadian government have stepped forward with decisive measures designed to protect domestic industries and stimulate economic growth. At the heart of the plan is a reduction in foreign steel imports, a move that not only defends Canadian producers but also strengthens national supply chains. By cutting tariff-free steel imports from non-free trade partners from 50% to just 20% of 2024 levels, Canada is opening up hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic demand. This shift ensures that Canadian steel, rather than cheaper foreign alternatives, meets the country's manufacturing needs, from automotive production to food and beverage packaging. Further actions target imports from non-CUSMA free trade area partners, reducing tariff-free steel imports from 100% to 75% of previous levels.
So let me start with limiting foreign steel imports to ensure that our steel producers have a bigger share of our market. Doing so will unlock hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic demand for those producers. We will reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-free trade area partners from 50% of 2024 levels, as it is today, to 20% of those levels. This will open up more than $850 million in new domestic demand for Canadian steel. Second, we will reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-CUSMA free trade area partners from 100% of 2024 levels to 75% of those levels, unlocking more than $540 million in additional market access for our producers.
This measure alone is projected to unlock over $500 million in additional market access for Canadian producers. Beyond simply limiting imports, Canada is imposing a global 25% tariff on imported steel derivative products, items such as wind towers, prefabricated buildings, fasteners, and wires. These are products worth nearly $10 billion, and the move is expected to redirect demand toward Canadian-made alternatives. To ensure these measures are effective, the Canadian Border Service Agency is strengthening compliance measures. A dedicated steel compliance team will monitor imports, detect false declarations more efficiently, and expand online reporting tools to keep the process transparent and accountable. Temporary tariff remissions, previously implemented to ease the early impact on businesses, will be phased out by January 31, 2026, specifically for steel used in Canadian manufacturing, food packaging, and agriculture. This strategic shift emphasizes the long-term goal of reducing dependence on imported steel while giving Canadian companies time to adjust and capitalize on domestic production. But the strategy does not end with steel alone. The Canadian government is positioning itself as its own best customer, channeling investment into domestic infrastructure projects that prioritize Canadian materials. Roads, bridges, homes, and community centres will increasingly be built using steel and lumber sourced from within Canada. Contracts exceeding $25 million, particularly those funded through federal grants or contribution programs, will require Canadian steel and lumber, reinforcing the demand for domestic products and ensuring that taxpayer money supports national industries. Multi-year shovel-ready projects have been earmarked to maximize the use of Canadian softwood lumber in housing and infrastructure. With an allocation of roughly $700 million next year through the Build Canada Homes initiative, this approach alone is expected to create $70 to $140 million in new demand for Canadian wood products, attracting additional private and provincial investment. By streamlining supply chains and prioritizing domestic materials, Canada aims to build not just structures, but a more resilient and self-reliant economy. Transportation has also been identified as a critical factor. To make it more affordable to move steel and lumber across provinces, the government plans to cut interprovincial freight rates by 50%, working directly with Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railways.
Will impose a global 25% tariff on targeted imported steel derivative products, such as wind towers, prefabricated buildings, fasteners and wires, to grow demand for Canadian-made steel. Those products as a whole represent about a $10 billion market. And we will toughen our broader compliance measures to prevent foreign steel dumping. To do so, the Canadian Border Service Agency will be equipped with a dedicated steel compliance team, enhanced detection of false declarations, and expanded online reporting tools.
This ensures that high-quality Canadian products can reach construction sites and manufacturing hubs efficiently, keeping costs competitive and reducing reliance on imports. Support for workers and businesses in the steel and lumber sectors is another central component of Canada's strategy. Expanded work-sharing programs and higher income replacement ratios, from 55% to 70%, will help employers retain skilled labor during this transition. Additional funding, including $500 million to the Business Development Bank of Canada's Softwood Lumber Guarantee Program and $500 million for the Large Enterprise Tariff Loan Facility, ensures that companies have access to financing and credit support to restructure operations and navigate liquidity pressures. A single-window application process will simplify access to federal support for forestry companies, allowing them to navigate the broad array of programs available without unnecessary bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the launch of the Canadian Forest Sector Transformation Task Force will bring together provincial authorities, territorial representatives, and industry experts to identify new growth opportunities, encourage innovation, and transform challenges into competitive advantages. This multi-pronged approach is not just about protecting Canadian jobs or industries, it carries significant implications for the U.S. as well. American businesses that rely on Canadian steel and lumber for manufacturing, construction, or energy projects will feel the effects of reduced imports and higher tariffs. Costs may rise, projects could face delays, and the competitive dynamics of the North American supply chain could shift in unforeseen ways. For U.S. policymakers and business leaders, this is a moment to reassess trade strategies and prepare for a new phase in the Canada-U.S. economic relationship. For Canadian industries, the message is clear: adapt, innovate, and seize the opportunity created by these protective measures. The government's plan is designed not merely as a short-term shield but as a long-term blueprint for resilience. By reducing reliance on imported materials, encouraging domestic production, and investing in infrastructure, Canada is positioning its steel and lumber sectors for growth in an increasingly competitive global market. The stakes are high, and the timeline is pressing. The coming months will determine how effectively Canadian producers can scale operations, how quickly infrastructure projects can integrate domestic materials, and how the interplay between U.S. tariffs and Canadian policy unfolds. For workers, business owners, and investors on both sides of the border, this is not just trade policy, it's a defining moment that will shape the economic landscape for years to come. As the ripple effects continue, one thing is certain: Canada is taking decisive steps to protect its industries, support its workforce, and redefine its role in the North American market. For the US, the implications are equally significant, highlighting the interdependence of two neighboring economies and the complex consequences of tariffs and trade policy.